So I've had the opportunity to speak with some of you during the dinner, and I feel that there's an overall understanding amongst us on the importance of law, and more specifically on the importance of law within the Palestinian context. And I think I can also assume that many of you believe that law is a potential solution to the Palestinian predicament. And I would agree with you simply for the reason that international law, as it is written, supports the Palestinian struggle for freedom and self-determination. And on top of that, as we all know, Israel holds the world record for blatant violations of international law. Indeed, Israel commits one crime after another, after another, after another. And just to give you a reminder of the crimes that we have witnessed, we've seen the dispossession and violent takeover of Palestine by Israel and the denial of the right of return for the Palestinian refugees. We've seen torture, illegal detention of children, assassinations, assaults against civilians with missiles, helicopters, and jet fighters. We've seen the continued illegal annexation of territory and demolition of homes on an unthinkable scale. We've seen daily humiliation and suffering at illegal checkpoints, and we've seen the mass killing of Palestinians in Sabra, Shatila, Jenin, Qana, and Gaza. The list is endless. But I'm not here to depress you, but rather my message for you today is that there is finally a legal movement to hold Israel accountable for crimes committed against the Palestinian people and to deter future crimes from being committed. And this movement is driven by people like you and me, lawyers, students, activists, academics, and so on. And it's driven primarily by civil society because we are fed up of empty statements given by world leaders who claim that Israel is acting illegally but end up doing nothing about it. And because Israel will only change if we force it to. So having set the legal background, I'd like to tell you a little bit about our organization, the Palestine Legal Aid Fund, and then I'm going to describe two cases that we are currently supporting. Our motivation is driven by two fundamental beliefs, which I've touched on earlier. One, providing access to justice to the Palestinians, and two, in securing accountability on the part of Israelis and their supporters who generally consider themselves above the law. Therefore, to that end, we have set up a professionally managed organization which has a sole purpose to identify, fund, and facilitate strategic legal action in support of the Palestinian people. The goal is to create a coordinated, strategic, and sustainable effort to bring the Palestinian cause before international courts. The movement is unprecedented in the Palestinian context because of a few barriers. But the main barrier is that international lawyers who support the Palestinians are expected to work on a voluntary basis. While this may be commendable, it can never amount to a long-term effort to provide Palestinians with the highest quality legal representation. And it is this, not continued humanitarian aid, which offers Palestinians hope. Therefore, the Palestine Legal Aid Fund facilitates this work and financially supports these lawyers who take on cases on behalf of the Palestinian people. The fund engages them on significantly reduced rates, and we are responsible for making sure that the milestones are set and met and that the cases progress. So to tell you a little bit about our internal governance, we are incorporated in the UK as a non-profit organization with exclusively charitable objects. We are completely independent in our decision-making processes and are not influenced by any political or corporate agenda. We have established important partnerships. Our main partner in the occupied West Bank is Al-Haq, probably the most well-established human rights NGO on the ground. All the directors of the fund are volunteers, and we are highly qualified in both the legal and corporate worlds. We have an advisory board of international lawyers, academics, doctors, military experts, and human rights observers. Our main advisor in Jordan is jurist Dr. Anis Qasim. We were inspired by the International Defense and Aid Fund in South Africa, which dedicated £100 million to support legal actions against the apartheid state over the course of 30 years. They supported Nelson Mandela's defense against the death penalty in 1964. So it was a very effective organization and one that we hope we will replicate, if not surpass, in terms of achievements. So that's enough about that. If you have any questions about our structure or mission, I'd be happy to answer them later. But the point I want to stress is, if it wasn't for the Palestine Legal Aid Fund, very few legal cases in support of Palestinians would currently be pursued. And to give you an example, to illustrate the importance of our work, I'd like to draw your attention to two cases that we are currently supporting. One related to the recent attack on the Flotilla, and the second related to Jerusalem. So starting with the attack on the Flotilla, as you all know, the Freedom Flotilla was a group of 6 vessels carrying humanitarian aid to Gaza. The flotilla was attacked by the Israeli military exactly 1 month ago in the middle of the night and in international waters. 9 activists were murdered in the attack and dozens were wounded, and hundreds of activists were illegally abducted and imprisoned. So after we had recovered from the shock of the attack, my team, understanding the gravity and criminality of the attack, immediately engaged and funded UK lawyers who prepared legal advice for passengers. This advice was translated and disseminated to many of the detainees and subsequently adopted and disseminated by Amnesty International. These lawyers then prepared questionnaires for the detainees and collected eyewitness testimonies, which were then compiled into a database. The fund supported this because we knew that any other future legal action or investigation would depend crucially on the preservation and collection of evidence sufficient to meet legal standards. Since that stage has been completed, we now believe that a series of war crimes were and/or continue to be committed by the Israeli forces. These include willful killing, inhumane treatment, willfully causing great suffering or serious injury, unlawful deportation or transfer, unlawful confinement, taking of hostages, extensive appropriation of property, and theft by the Israeli military. So all in all, in light of the nature of these crimes committed against international passengers, we are now presented with a unique opportunity to address Israel's conduct in courts around the world. Therefore, the Palestine Legal Aid Fund has now engaged a legal team to coordinate an international legal committee, which includes key lawyers from 24 countries who represent the individuals on board. The committee will enable the sharing of evidence and expertise to ensure that the best cases are brought to court. And we now believe there is sufficient evidence capable of supporting the arrest and charges against specific Israeli officials. In fact, the fund is already supporting 2 important cases. One case will shortly be launched in Belgium against Israeli officials on behalf of the 5 Belgian citizens that were on board the flotilla. The other case, which will also be launched shortly in Spain, is against Israeli officials on behalf of the Spanish citizens who are on the flotilla. These are actual concrete cases that seek to hold Israeli officials criminally liable for their actions. We are also supporting lawyers who are determining whether the International Criminal Court may be an avenue to achieve legal redress. And the reason I'm going into detail on the flotilla cases is to make the following points. 1, the legal route is available and waiting for us to take advantage of it. 2, the lawyers are there. They're ready to do the work in a professional way at very reduced rates. But without the fund, none of this work would have happened, and very little future work will happen. We are finally living in a moment where we can tell Israel no more. We are not taking it anymore, and if this criminal behavior does not stop, we will make it stop. So I'd like to turn your attention now to a very important case related to Jerusalem. Jerusalem, as we are all aware, needs a little help these days. It has been cut off from the rest of the West Bank. There are increasingly more plans to turn Palestinian districts into Jewish biblical parks. Many Israelis today already consider Jerusalem to be part of Israel. And that's why we believe that this case is so important. It is against a senior Israeli official who is directly responsible for the demolition of homes in East Jerusalem. This is a war crimes case that can be launched in several countries. The goal here is to have this Israeli official arrested for the crimes being committed in East Jerusalem, namely home demolitions in the context of accelerated Jewish settlement in East Jerusalem. As part of this case, we are currently supporting lawyers whose task is to prepare an evidence file on this individual. We have a team of lawyers in the UK and in Palestine who are working to finalize the case. And just so you have an idea of how these things work in broad terms, i.e. the breakdown of the case process, the first step is to complete the file, as I just mentioned. It is then presented to the police and then the state prosecutor. The second step is to seek a criminal investigation. This ideally would lead to arrest, charges, and prosecution. So that's the process in brief, but the significance is clear. If successful, it would resonate massively in Israel as demolitions and settlement building would be shown to be a criminal act. Plus, it would turn the spotlight on Israel's takeover of East Jerusalem and would put the whole project of settlement building at risk. So we believe that this case is definitely one worth supporting. So the Flotilla case and the case on Jerusalem is just two of the cases we're supporting, but there's a lot of other exciting work we are doing, and I'd be happy to brief you on a one-on-one basis later if you're interested. I'd like to turn your attention now to some of our previous work, because even though we're a new organization, we've already achieved success. One case we supported was a challenge against the UK government. This is a BBC news story on the case. In this case, we argued that the UK was acting illegally in its relationship with Israel. As part of our evidence, we used the example of the UK's continued arms trade with Israel. This type of legal case is important because it highlights the point that Israel could not get away with what it's doing if it wasn't for the direct or indirect support of the international community. Instead of describing the case in further details, I'd like to share with you a short clip that summarizes the case.
The British government's arms deals and diplomatic relations with Israel have been thrust into the legal limelight this week. Representing a Palestinian NGO, British human rights lawyers made an application on Tuesday at the royal courts. They claim British support for Israel is against international law and should be subjected to judicial review.
We say that the UK is in clear breach of international law, and for some time it's had the very clearest of legal duties that it must make. It must render aid and assistance to Israel. It must publicly denounce what's happened. It must do everything it can to ensure respect for Geneva Convention provisions. It must recognise the illegality of what Israel's done.
Last month's attacks on Gaza provoked an outpouring of public support in Britain for Palestinians. A legal aid fund was established to help Gazans seek legal redress for alleged human rights violations. The fund is now financing this case.
We established the Gaza Legal Aid Fund following Israel's recent attack on Gaza. Our objectives are basically to fill a funding gap. There are so many Palestinian victims that have sought legal redress. They have sought legal action, but they haven't been able to finance it, and that's where we come in.
Tuesday's case holds 3 British ministers responsible for refusing to hold Israel accountable. In less than a week, the court could decide if the case will go ahead. The Foreign Office has since responded with a statement saying it has one of the tightest regulations in the world on arms sales and would vigorously defend any proceedings against its ministers.
Every application from Israel or anywhere else is judged against the criteria of whether those arms sales will contribute to internal repression or external aggression. And if there is a risk of that, those sales do not go ahead.
If this case is successful, it could have tremendous implications. First of all, it will send a message to other Western nations who give support to Israel. And secondly, it could prevent another attack like the one in January 2009 in Gaza from happening again. Freya Anand, Press TV, London.
Thank you. Thank you. So several months after this clip was taken, the claim was judged to be a matter of foreign policy and it was denied. However, the case was nonetheless successful in an indirect way for many reasons. First, it pressured the UK government to admit that British-made weapons were used by the Israelis in Operation Cast Lead. As you saw there, he was denying that. After our case, they admitted it. Second, it pressured the UK government to review all the arms export licenses given to Israel. And third, and most importantly, this concluded in a limited but important embargo on certain weapons components sold to Israel. So this illustrates the point that you don't necessarily have to win a case in order for it to have an impact. So in a nutshell, the fund supported a case that stopped the UK from exporting certain arms to Israel. And this is certainly something to be proud of, and it's something we're studying the possibility of raising a similar case in other jurisdictions like the US. So looking ahead, the fund will be consumed with the Flotilla work that I described and the Jerusalem case. Both need support. And if you'd like an update on the progress of these cases, you can sign up on our website, humanrightsfund.org. Over the next 3 years, we intend to file a minimum of 6 to 7 strategic actions across a range of legal avenues and jurisdictions. And this strategy is meant to diversify the legal risk and maximize the potential of success. Because for the movement to have an effect, it has to be done intelligently. In fact, this work, even though it's in its early stages, has already put the Israeli government on guard. For example, Israel has recently pursued a public relations strategy of discrediting human rights-based litigation strategies as lawfare, which they define as a strategy of using or misusing the law. This is clearly not the case, because all we are seeking is an implementation of the law. But the point is, if Israel has nothing to fear from these cases, they surely would not need to engage in such public relation strategy. So just to conclude, because I think I've spoken enough, I hope that I've conveyed the message as to why this work is a strong intellectual and strategic response to Israeli aggression, which will reap tangible and long-term results. And if done properly, it will eventually hold Israel and its allies accountable for their violations of Palestinian rights. We must resist using all means possible, but given the political and power realities on the ground, legal resistance may well be the resistance of choice. And moreover, we have a moral imperative. We have a moral duty to provide access to justice for the Palestinians and give them their essential day in court. At the very least, they deserve that. Thank you. Thank you for listening.